I'm going to show you a couple of series today. One is Bedrooms of the Fallen, the other is January 6th, but I want to show you a couple of photographs to show you how I got there. Back in 2003, I was a little nobody. I'm a bigger one now, but I guess I've dedicated my life the last 30 years to telling the stories of refugees around the world. Telling the stories, trying to humanize the plight of the vulnerable to my racist countrymen, then Australian, now Americans. 2002, that took me to Iraq. In 2003, you guys joined me. And for the first time, I met Americans en masse. But this time you fell from the sky instead of jumping out of tour buses in Paris and Sydney, and you had guns. My focus shifted and I saw men fighting. And I wanted to know how we could fire guns at one another in anger with such vengeance and confidence. I spent over a decade trying to understand, and I never really answered that. I still return to combat sometimes, and I still can't come to terms with it. There might be something wrong, something short-circuiting in my brain, I'm not sure. But what I learned is how we kill. We kill because we don't kill other humans. We kill symbols of them. The Marines aren't shooting at Abu Muhammad, who studied to become a doctor just to help refugees, just as he'd been. They're shooting at Al-Qaeda, who ran planes into the Twin Towers. The insurgents that killed their friend in a roadside bomb last week. The Mujahideen aren't shooting at Billy Miller, who used to cover himself in cicadas every 4 years to his sister Sabrina's horror. They're killing an infidel, poisoning their culture, stealing their land and their oil. We kill symbols of each other. My photographs did nothing to solve that. I failed. They look like a Hollywood movie, people would tell me, and I'd privately berate myself. War is personal, they say, and Iraq was yours, always your war. Until November 15, and I needed to see a dead Mujahideen fighter in a mosque's minaret. And a captain sent a squad with me. I protested and eventually accepted. And a Marine, William Miller, was shot point blank in the face as a result. My fault. Your war turned into our war. That's Billy. To his left is DeMarcus Brown. He died 2 days later. All I could do was make an apology, a memorial. I had to make something to resolve the failure of a decade's worth of work, something to say sorry to Susie and Lewis, Billy's parents. I photographed funerals, cemeteries. It didn't work. I attended memorials. Everything I photographed was presence. It was people remembering and grieving. It lacked the point of death, absence. Again and again, my work was falling short. And at some point, I saw a photograph by Eugene Richards at a presentation at Charlottesville that you guys hosted. Of his dead father's shirt hanging in a closet. And there was something haunting to it, something absent that led slowly to the concept of bedrooms of the fallen. Intact bedrooms of service members killed in combat. I called dozens of families and over about 2 years photographed 6 bedrooms. I went to Kathy Ryan. I remember it as though it were yesterday. Sunny Wednesday, sitting at the little round table in the corner with a great view of 40th Street, stacked high with portfolios, and Kathy came over. I talked to her through the images, and Kathy had always been straight with me. She still is. Today was no different. She was all in. She gave me her office so I could work in privacy. She gave me the funding I needed, and perhaps most importantly, the emotional support I desperately needed through the project. This is Brandon Craig's bedroom. He lived in Earlyville, Maryland. I had this ceremony that I'd do every time I went to one of these bedrooms. I photographed 40 in all. And I would visit the schools, I would visit the churches that they prayed at, I would visit anything I could find about the soldiers. I would visit these places. And then I would have a coffee and a smoke and then visit the family. There was no coffee shop in Earlyville. So I went to the gas station, no coffee. So I had a Red Bull and a smoke at the gas station. And I watched chickens running around the gas pumps. Like, this is where these guys are from, you know. Niels Thompson is from a little town called Confluence, Pennsylvania, with a population of about 30. Close to falling water is the only reason you would know it. Karina Lau, It was from Livingston, California. Actually watched her helicopter burn as I drove into Iraq on my third rotation. She died outside of Fallujah with 40 other soldiers when her helicopter was shot down by insurgents. These bedrooms are frozen in time, the moment the soldiers left to go to war to meet their ends. Their parents would rarely enter. This was Andrew Grennan's bedroom, and his father never crossed the threshold of his boy's room. He never took his son's dressing gown off his bed. His son literally showered and went to Afghanistan. I couldn't cross the threshold of that bedroom either, and I photographed it from the hallway. I treat the rooms the same way as the parents would. I couldn't touch a thing. I couldn't place a tripod leg on a bed. I couldn't lean on a wall. I had to ask his parents to turn lights on if it was too dark. These were sacred spaces and not mine. I treated them with a deeper respect than any space I've ever been in. I always felt like the kid was going to come home and walk in to find me there. "The fuck are you doing in my room?" I imagined him saying. "I thought you were dead," I imagined responding. They felt so close, so present. You could smell them in there. Feel as though they weren't really gone, but the second you walked out, the absence hit like a 10,000-pound weight on your chest. The bedrooms, as Kathy would later explain to me when she called to tell me the title, the magazine had given the story, were shrines, and the shrines were connected. This is Jordan Hayata's bedroom. He lived in Sag Harbor, Long Island. He died protecting his platoon. You can see over his shoulder. He's the guy looking over his shoulder in the poster. He stood his ground as a truck bomber approached his base, and he shot the truck bomber dead, attached to a dead man's switch, which killed him, saving the 40 men behind him and 160 Iraqis, including Nick Exaros, who got home and then re-signed up and stepped on a landmine 6 months later in Afghanistan. Can't really have favorites of tragedy, but this is one of my favorites. It's in Scotland. Felt like the edge of the world. Bobby McLaren, he was part of the Black Watch Regiment, and he hated his carpet because it was girly. But his mum told him for his entire 20-year life that it was fine, there's nothing wrong with it. Beyond memorializing the men and women, the aim of this work was to make these soldiers relatable, to make them one of us. I wanted to remove the stigmas, draw them out of the military, and pull them away from the conceits of heroism and sacrifice. I wanted to remind the viewers that these bedrooms could easily have belonged to our very own brothers and sisters, our own mothers and fathers, or our own cherished sons and daughters. The only person in the book to have survived combat, only to die at home, was Ryan Gilbertson, who killed himself by overdosing at his drug dealer's house after a tour of Iraq. He came home desperately struggling with PTSD and was failed by the VA. His bedroom was the final one in the book. It showed that war comes home. The battle finishes when the last shot is fired, when the last man falls. In the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, the wars will never really finish. Not for me or hundreds of thousands of others. While combat has a beginning and an end, those who experience it dwell on what happens between those 2 points. We wonder what would have happened if we had done things differently, made different choices. We wonder whose lives could have and should have been spared. Trauma extends, though, beyond our veterans. We're a nation scarred by the longest conflict in our history. When war becomes a quagmire, nihilism sets in. Faith in government is lost. You add a sprinkle of COVID to the mix, and we're a nation on edge. I had no idea how close we were to the precipice when Kathy and Amy from the New York Times Magazine called me to go to Washington to cover a rally called Stop the Steal. Normally I've got a pretty good judgment at news, not this time. I wasn't really convinced, but Amy offered a double day rate. So I accepted. Memory is subjective, and narratives are too easily manipulated by lobbyists and talking heads. But news images cannot lie by themselves. Other people will use them to support a case, maybe even lie about the facts around the images. Your insurrectionist is another man's patriot, like Presidents 46 and 47 of the United States. Polar opposites. Same protagonists, same events. One says it's a federal crime, the other says they're heroes. A shameful attack versus a day of love. What I saw doesn't change. Thousands of people attacked police and forced their way into the United States Capitol, where they hunted senators and the vice president looking for blood. I saw militia members and men that were trained and ready for violence. I also saw people who looked like lost tourists. Overall, what I witnessed wasn't a rally. It was an insurrection and an attempted coup. And my photographs will show that regardless of anybody's definitions. 100 years can pass and Americans may still argue over patriots or criminals. But those images will show exactly what that day was, one of the darkest in our nation's history. That night, I wrote a journal of 4,000 words in case I was deposed. Thankfully, I wasn't, thanks to the New York Times General Counsel. But one of the bright moments of that day described a man we would later learn was Officer Eugene Goodman. There were no police to be seen, and it feels like there's no sense of where people are going. No idea where the chambers are, and apparently they were right there when we walked in. I have no idea. It's my first time here, like it is for most of the rioters today. And they're moving through the hallways. The front group stops, and I walk into the scene, and there's one police officer standing there shouting at this group, and he's telling them to stop. And they're telling him to move. And they move towards him, and he grabs his pistol. I see him unclip the weapon from the holster, and I make sure there's a protester between me and him. 10 inches of flesh should be enough to stop a 9mm, I figure, and I keep working. But incredibly, this officer, an African-American officer, being confronted by scores of white nationalists, one of them actually carrying a Confederate flag. Others in helmets and armor, some of them with spears and bats, shows restraint. He threatens and shouts, he points and screams and holds his ground and talks into a small radio on his shirt, and then he runs up the stairs. And the group follows, and they round the stairs, and they follow him into a room with more officers. Journalism is one of the least trusted fields in the United States today, and perhaps with good reason. Most members of the public see our industry as supporting a particular party or view over the traditional work of objective hacks seeking facts and evidence. Somehow opinion writing has become journalism, and for-profit journalism has been pushed into a corner to support views in politics. The images I'm showing today are intended to counter that. They're documents. And I think that we're all here to support that, objectivity and fairness to our subjects and to our readers. I remember in 2004, Dexter Filkins, a reporter, asked me to cross a field in Fallujah under fire during a fierce sniper battle to photograph some suspected, we can go back to the other guy, Eugene, yeah. During a fierce sniper battle to photograph some suspected insurgent tunnels. I swore at him the whole way over, and when we arrived, we discovered there were no tunnels and had to return through that goddamn field. This time I really swore, and I told him that if the bullets didn't kill him, I fucking well would. Years later, working on our retrospective books, I called him to fact-check the event. Dexter swore it never happened. His memory had changed over time. It had morphed. It happens to all of us. But I had the photographs, and those hadn't changed. The photographs had stood up. Thank you.